if running two law firms, doing a podcast weren't enough, you're also writing a book, right?
Yeah, I'm 60,000 words into a novel. And the thing, if you're out and people say, so what do you do? Right? So many of us default to our day jobs. And when I'm asked that question, lawyer appears like seventh or eighth on the list of the way that I think of myself. I like being a lawyer now. I didn't when I was in big law, but I like the work that I do now. And I like the challenge of it and all that kind of stuff. But if I didn't make money doing it, I would stop now. Wouldn't do it. I don't find that the law itself is intrinsically interesting at all.
Welcome to Founding Partner Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hawkins. Excited about today's guest. He's doing a lot of really interesting things that I want to explore. I'll give you a little teaser here. So one thing, he's got two separate law firms or two law firms that he's running. So we're going to dive into that. I know there's some attorneys that think about that and maybe are doing that, but Owen's doing it. We're going to talk about it. Another interesting thing he's done is he's moved away from hourly billing. And not only that, he's sort of progressed along and sort of moved through a variety of different billing models. And so I want to really dive into that as well. So Owen McGrann, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us where you are, what you do, and anything else you want to say.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Jonathan. This is a podcast that I do listen to because I like learning from other people's mistakes and not just having to do them all myself. And I think podcasts like this do a great service for the community. I'm Owen McGrann. I am an attorney in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the good city in the state. I do own two law firms because I'm a masochist. I have one firm that's a business firm. I work primarily with startups. Everything from let's get you, formed up through funding rounds and exit. And then I have a firm that does estate planning, and prior to that, I worked for years in big law and it literally nearly killed me. So
yeah, okay, so let's go back. So you were at big law and you decided to go out and leave for whatever reason. So what was your reason? What was the spark that caused you to leave?
yeah, so it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? So I was in big law. I got seriously ill and had to step away from practicing law for about a year and a half. In the process, I nearly died once on an operating table. I had a surgery that the doctors told me as I was being wheeled into the OR that had a 10% chance of not exactly the kind of thing you want to hear as the anesthesia is taking hold, right? Obviously survived that. And then about a year and a half later had an organ transplant, which I'm very happy that I got, but I don't recommend to a friend unless it's going to keep you alive because not a whole lot of fun. And so it wasn't a clean move from being in big law, being miserable in big law and saying, screw it, I'm out. I was in big law. I had to stop practicing because I was not healthy enough on a day-to-day basis to do the hard work that you have to do to practice law anywhere, let alone in the sort of cauldron of a big firm. So there was about a 18 to 24 month period there where I wasn't working a whole lot. I was tutoring because I had to have something to do. And then after my transplant, my wife, who was an absolute saint, supporting us basically the entire way through it, said, could you maybe start making some money again? This is killing me. And at that point, it was a sort of moment where I'd been a lawyer at that point for 11 years, right? So it was wrapped up into the way that I thought about myself. And I wasn't sure what else to do, right? You hear all the time, well, with a JD, you can do anything. It's like, yeah, but the hard part isn't necessarily the opportunity. It's the mindset of I'm a lawyer, or the way that you think about yourself tends to be the real issue with moving on to something else. And so when my wife approached me and said, you needed, please, the bank account, help. The thought of going back to a big firm gave me heart palpitations. I mean, it just was not something that I could envision myself doing, but I still thought of myself as an attorney. So I said, and my wife in more colorful language, I'm not sure whether or not I'm allowed to swear on the podcast.
Go for it.
Yeah. She said, yeah, but you don't know what the fuck you're doing. And I said, you're absolutely right. I've never done this. She said, I think you should do it. If after a year you break even or are revenue positive, then you got something, let's go with it. So I made it through the year, 6 figures into the positive, which was better than I expected for a first year, not knowing what I was doing. And so that's sort of how I got into this. It was an easier transition for me because I didn't have the thing that stops a lot of people from opening their own firm. I already wasn't making money, right? So there wasn't the pressure of, if I leave this job, am I going to be able to pay the mortgage? Am I going to be able to take care of my family? Am I going to fall flat on my face? At that point, I was basically already at ground zero. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect for folks who do have the courage to leap from something stable and, something that is supporting them and their family into the unknown. I was already sort of wandering on the forest and decided I was going to start trying to blaze a trail.
Well, that's cool. I mean, number one, for your wife, all the above, being there along the way, and maybe not to be too overly dramatic, but I mean, you sort of looked death in the face. And after that, I mean, what's starting a law firm, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, at that point you realize that, you're playing with house money, right? And, when you realize, it's funny. All of us know that we die, right? We being the collective, right? It's something very different to realize that I am going to die, right? Those are two fundamentally different kind of knowledge. And once you realize that, you know, you are finite, that there's only so far that your road goes, it's actually freeing, right? Because all of a sudden you don't have to do everything, right? Because if you're thinking of your life as somehow, this, I can do anything that I want, that's a lot of pressure, because if everything is available, then you want to try to do everything, right? When you know that, oh no, I've got just this little bit, then you get to choose how you want to spend it in a way that's impactful and meaningful to you.
That's powerful stuff. And so, shifting back to the law just briefly. So, you did big law, and you're doing what kind of work did you do there? Was it a natural sort of segue into your firm, or did you just completely
No.
switch practice areas?
Yeah. So I was doing, high stakes corporate litigation for Fortune 50 companies, helping them slap fight each other, right? I mean, it was the most soul emptying work that I've ever, it was just, you know, I had people that I went to law school like, man, you made it. And I was like, this is fucking miserable, right? I don't do anything of value to anybody other than shift money from one bank account to
Yeah.
another. And, so there, it's, you lead a weird double life that way, where to the outside, it looks like you're making it, right? You have what most people go to law school hoping to do. And then you get into it and you're like, oh, wait, this wasn't the deal, right? Of course, it is the deal. You just don't typically realize it until you're too far into it to easily extract.
And then they encourage you to get the nice fancy watch and the nice car, the nice
That's right.
house, and then you're
You
stuck.
make it
You're
impossible
stuck.
to walk
Yeah,
away.
you're
Right.
stuck.
That's right. And so when I opened my firm, initially it's like, okay, cool. I'm going to call up all the people I know. Jonathan, I hate to break it to you and anybody else listening. A Fortune 50 company is not hiring a solo in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to do anything. Period. That is not the market. And so there was it wasn't a moment of panic. It was a season of panic where I was like, oh, well, shit, I don't know what to do here, because what I know how to do, what I used to be able to trade on and get work for, is no longer an open avenue to run a business. And one of the few smart things I've done in my life was I stepped back and I said, okay, well, if that's not going to be it, I didn't ask myself what I think is a typical thing, which is, well, what kind of law do I want to practice? I asked myself, who are the people that I really liked working with? And I realized that my favorite clients were entrepreneurs, the people who were crazy enough to go try to build something out of nothing and to make those leaps. Those were the people who, when their names appeared on my phone, I was excited to pick it up. Right. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to learn how to work with those people. And so that's how I sort of moved into startup law and working with entrepreneurs.
So I'm curious. So, I bootstrapped my practice area. I did not have at the firms I
Yeah.
was working at, there was no one that did what I do now. And I sort of
Right.
had to myself. So it's, what did you do to, number one, pick the practice area you wanted to do, but then also just to learn it, make sure you know how to do it?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it is meeting people in the area that you want to serve, right? Talking with them and saying, what issues do you run into, right? And I think that one of the interesting things about the way that I develop my practice, I practice law, but only sort of in the startup world, right? I'm as much a business. I can talk go to market with anybody, right? And I can talk about, okay, let's really drill down on, about this product. What does it do? What's the audience? Now you're just talking about features here. What does it? What problem does it solve, right? And so I learned my way into the field, not necessarily by learning the law, but by learning the business. And when you start understanding the business, you start seeing the way that law sort of infiltrates into it, and the sinews that go through the body of that area. And so you start saying, okay, well, this operating agreement really doesn't do what you want it to, because and so you can sort of work your way backwards into the practice of it.
And I'd argue probably that's the better approach. I mean,
Yeah.
because you've probably seen it. I know I've seen it where you've got lawyers that come in and over lawyer and perhaps change the
Everything.
deal, change from what the client actually wants because they think they're doing the right thing and they don't know any better.
Hmm. Yeah, all the
Yeah.
time. And the thing that I pride myself on is that I approach everything as the business person first, right? The law is there as a supporting character, right? They're not the lead. And, if a lawyer comes in and say there's some risk here, it's like, yeah, no kidding. Risk is the currency of business. If there's no risk, it's not worth doing, right? The question is whether or not we're fully apprised of what the risk is and whether or not we can make a good business case to take the risk.
That I do that a lot too. So it's like, I mean, look, nothing is risk free. If you want to do the most conservative thing, you can do this. If you're willing to take some risk, you can do this. And let's say you want to take all the risk. If something goes wrong, it's only going to be like a $10,000 problem. It might be worth doing it.
Hmm.
You know,
Right. The upside might be the thing that you want to play for, right? And I tell other lawyers that, and they're like, well, you're going to get people arrested. I said, no, like, we're within an Overton window of risk here, right? This isn't like, yeah, go commit securities fraud, right?
yeah, yeah. Okay, so all right, so you've got two law firms. So first of all, when you decided to go out on your own, did you say, "All right, I'm starting two law firms," or did you start one and then the other one came later? How did that happen?
Yeah. So I started the business firm first, and that was what it was exclusively. I started getting some clients who were family businesses that wanted to do succession planning for the business. And as I was working through that, I started realizing, oh, we need to do some estate planning here to get this done properly. And I just sort of taught myself estate planning. And once you get a tradable skill like that, you say, well, I can probably, use this as a secondary, platform for something. And it operated under the same roof for about 2 years. And it was never more than about a quarter of revenue, which was perfectly fine. It was a nice chunk of fairly steady, money. I was approached by another attorney in Pittsburgh who said, hey, how about we open an estates firm together? And she is a wonderful person. Our values were very much aligned. And I said, yeah, let's do it. So I know that you had Scott Snellings on here before. He talks about paying your tuition,
Mm-hmm.
right? I paid some tuition in this partnership. I have absolutely nothing but good things to say about my partner in that. We had common values, but we did not have a common vision. And, she wanted to do a very white glove, high end kind of service. And I wanted to do something that was more, not automated, but more modern, right? Where, I put together a Calendly type system where people could schedule meetings. She was like, no, I want to be in control of my calendar. I was like, okay, that's going to take up a significant amount of your time. And if what we're trying to do here is to build a low friction system where we can move people through and give really quality estate plans without spending a huge amount of our time. And so we ended up splitting about a year into it. And so I had two firms at that point. I kept it that way because it turns out that the two clients, the ideal client profiles for startup founder and estate planning person, radically different, and it's very difficult just from a marketing standpoint to speak to both under the same umbrella.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So true. So interesting. Talked to a lot of attorneys over the years, and they say, we've got these two sort of disparate practice areas. Let's say personal injury and family law, and they're like, it's
Mhm.
hard to market to both, as you just said. So the question is, do they spin it off and create a new firm,
Mhm.
or do they create a completely separate website, but sort of keep it under the same firm and just
Right.
market it differently? And, there's never really a clear answer. I've seen people do all the above, but it sounds like you were already in a separate firms. You just kept it there. And so let me just ask real
Yeah.
quick. I mean, do you have like different trust accounts and different websites and different marketing channels, all the above? It's just completely separate.
Yeah, they're entirely separate businesses, different EINs,
Oh, wow.
different, everything. If it hadn't been broken out, I probably just would have branded it differently, right? I mean, in my business firm, I have a separately branded, very low end subscription for membership for true startups. That's still the same business. It just has slightly different branding and a different website. But, it's already built out. And that technically, I run I run both of my firms on Lawmatics, and I needed separate builds for the two. And so I was just like, well, I've got it set up, and it'd probably be more of a headache to recombine than it would be to just keep them running separately. So,
Do you have staff or VAs or anything? And then how do are those run through the different firms? How do you do that?
yeah. So I do have staff. I've got 3 people. One, they're all VAs. Um, One is basically my ops person. She's an engineer by trade, very good at what she does. She works in both firms. I have one person working exclusively in the estates firm who handles phones and client communications and relationship. And then I have somebody in the business firm who does a lot of I have a lot of things process oriented. So if somebody comes and wants an LLC, I don't do that anymore. I've got that all built out, and Gabby will just go and do that. So, the part of what I've been trying to build in both firms is to get it away from me having to do things, partially because I'm lazy and partially because that's not the stuff that I'm very good at. Right. And so if I can build procedure and just have somebody go do it the same way each time, that's a lot better than me getting bored and getting creative and messing things up.
It's funny from my own experience and from talking to other lawyers. It's hard enough in one firm having to manage the client work, get the clients, do
Uh-huh.
the operations, manage the employees, do all that stuff, and you're doing it in two separate firms. How the hell are you doing it, man? And you've got a small baby and a bunch of other stuff. So how do you do it?
So, I think some of it is, my business firm is designed to be people come there to work with me, right? In the estates firm, they go to the firm to get an estate plan. And I've purposely marketed it so that the estate firm is not dependent upon my face showing up to places, right? It's got a trade name. It's purely estates law firm. It's not McGrann Law or anything like that. And, you know, there are a bunch of people who come through purely estates who don't ever actually meet me, right? We'll trade emails. I will, use Loom to explain things, and things like that. If they insist on meeting me, of course, I'm their attorney and I have the obligation to meet with them and all that kind of stuff. But it's designed to be a machine, right? Whereas on the business side, I'm on the phone or in Zoom calls or, you know, in that firm, people work with me to spend time with me helping them solve problems, right? But a secondary aspect of what you're asking about is I have ADHD. So if I do the same thing over and over again, I will quite literally jump out of a window. And so it suits my personality to be able to have a bunch of different things that I can jump into at any given time because I'm going to find one of those things interesting. Right. And with ADHD, our nervous system is based around what's interesting or fun. And so if I have enough things, I'm always going to be able to be engaged in doing something, even if it might not be what, my ops person wants me to be doing at any given time. So there's always something getting done.
Okay, so maybe piggybacking off of that a little bit, it's fun having different businesses. I know from personal experience, it's hard. Some people say you just got to go all in on one versus splitting
Mhm.
between the two. Do you ever
Yeah.
think about that? And, do you think you want to have lots of things so you can satisfy your ADHD thing? Or do you think, hey, maybe I should
Yeah.
just go all
Yeah.
in?
It is something that I think about every day, right? Whether or not having all of these things is actually serving me. We spoke a little bit before we hit record. I have 2 firms, but they are not performing equally, right? My business firm is thriving, right? I am having to turn away work, or looking to hire,
Mhm.
to help service some of the demand on that side. And it's wonderful. These are good problems to have. The estates firm is not doing as well, right? It's profitable, right? But there's a nagging part of me. Is it worth the time and the effort to continue this? I know that right now I'm just sort of tweaking knobs, and it can and will take off if I devote enough time and energy to it. But there's that question of, is it worth the time and effort, right? And so, you get into this issue where you have enough things going on. Are you ever devoting enough time to any of the individual things to really maximize the impact of them individually? Or it becomes a real question of whether or not I'm doing myself or the business's favors by having as many of them open as I do.
Well, on the estate side, I do like that you do have a trade name, it's not tied to you. You've set it
Hmm.
up in such a way that if you wanted to spin it off, sell it, or whatever, you could, which is nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the idea there is to get it set up so that it is, as we sort of discussed earlier, entirely process driven, right? Getting the marketing down so that it's portable to other markets, and then either franchise it, right? Or, something like that, where you can just sort of, the estate planning firm in a box. Here you go. And I think that there's a lot of potential there, right? But again, as you see, like, that's a whole other, like, next sort of turn of the screw of where are you going to get this time?
As a controversial figure, I'll say, but Elon Musk, the fact that he's running, more than
Hmm.
one, I don't know how many it is, maybe it's 4 or 5,
Yeah.
billion-dollar companies. I don't know how the hell. I know he's got a lot of people around him, but still, I don't know how
Hmm.
the mind space to be able to keep it all going.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm really focused on for 2025, I'm sure you're familiar with traction and EOS
Mm.
and all that kind of stuff. You'll be shocked to hear that I'm a classic visionary, right? I want to bring on an integrator where I can just throw these kind of ideas at and just say, okay, make it happen, please.
There's a post I think you made on LinkedIn a while back, and I wanted to touch on that. So,
Mm.
100%. You mentioned it about your partnership, the doomed partnership.
Mhm.
I'm a huge believer you got to have the similar vision. I mean, any business, you got to
Yeah.
have a vision. You got to know where you're going. But you had a post sort of, there's dangers to the vision component as well. Why don't you expand on that?
Yeah. So, the vision of any business is the lifeblood of the business, right? The visionary is the one that sort of powers the way that the business is built, the way it goes, and all that kind of stuff. But if a visionary is not tempered by an integrator or by somebody who says, well, that's a great idea, but the operations aren't going to do that right now, right? If a visionary is allowed to just go and dream, very little is going to get put into place, operationalized, and you need to let the dreamer go dream, right? But at the same time, there needs to be a tether back into the business to pull that vision back down to earth and say, okay, cool, we're going to do this thing. Not all of these things. Right now, we're going to, the rock for Q4 is going to be this. And, it's difficult for visionaries to not to see the value in it, but to want to do it, because the dreaming thing is the sexy thing, right? The doing the work is not nearly as fun.
You're speaking to me, man. You're speaking to me. I've not done that disc assessment. I hear people talk about the quick start. I don't even know what
Mhm.
that is, but it sounds like it's me because I'm like, okay, we're going to do this. And I start going. And then
Yeah.
a few weeks in, another squirrel runs across and I do the same thing over
Uh-huh.
there. Yeah, it is a blessing and a curse, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's important to recognize it in yourself. I think there are a lot of people who don't quite recognize that we can't do all these things, right? One of the best things that I ever did, and this was my ops person in our firm's Notion. She just put a category, good ideas for later, right? And so anytime I come up with something, I'll throw it past her and she's like, okay, that's going in good ideas for later. And because I know that it's captured, I can just kind of let it go, right? If I know that it's somewhere that I can go back to, I'm comfortable refocusing on what I'm supposed to be doing. But it used to be that, like, if I didn't have a repository for those things, it's like, we got to do this right now. And that's both good energy and bad energy at the same time, right?
That's funny. I had a similar thing. So what I created was I call it the brain dump list, or I just dump it
Hmm.
there. And
Yeah.
then I have a top 10 list that comes from the brain dump list. And then there's a top 3 that's like, we
Hmm.
can't do anything else till we get the 3. And then once the
Yeah.
3 or once one of the 3 gets done, we can add one from the top 10. And every now and then I
Hmm.
can go back and reassess the top 10. But yeah, I needed something like that. And the people around me needed something like that too. Cause they're like, every day I'd come in
Hmm.
and throw some new thing on the table. And they're like, what are we
Yeah.
supposed to do? Yeah,
Right. It's like, I thought we were doing, it's like, yeah, we were. Do that too. And
exactly.
it's like, we, we don't make enough money to do all this stuff, right? We're not staying overnight to do it. And, you know, it's really easy as a visionary to lose people working with you, right? Not because you're not a nice person or that you don't care about them or that you don't go out of your way to make a decent working environment for people. But if you're constantly 20 steps ahead, right? It's easy for folks working with and for you to feel as though what they're doing, one, is not enough, is not the right thing, is not pleasing you, right? And it can become a sort of accidentally toxic thing.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement and that thought. And for all the visionaries out there, word of caution. I have experienced that, and I think that's true. All right, well, let's shift again. There's some other stuff that over the years, yeah, I have seen you make a lot of posts, a lot on hourly versus flat fee or value billing. So we may get into that
Yeah.
a little bit, but I want to, at the big firm, obviously, I'm sure you just cranked out an ass ton of an hours. That's just what you do there.
Yeah.
But then you started your
Yep.
place, and I don't know if you started hourly, but you did go to value billing. You've sort of evolved over time with some of the things you've done. So why don't you take us through sort of the evolution of how you've charged your clients?
Yeah. Yeah. So it began the way that most of us begin. You go into a place and they teach you how they do it. And there is a 99% chance that the way that they do it is billing by the hour. And so I sort of unthinkingly, well, this is how it is. So this is what we're going to do. I was never good at keeping my time, right? I mentioned earlier I have ADHD. We're kind of time blind, right? I might think that I've been working on something for 10 hours and it's been 5 minutes, right? And there are other times where my wife comes down and says, are you ever going to come to bed? I was like, what is it, like, 10? She's like, it's 3 in the morning, right? But I had locked into something that was interesting. And so I was like full focus, hyper focused into that kind of thing. Keeping track of every 6 minutes of your life doesn't fit into that kind of relationship to time. And so, I'm not proud to say it, but there were a lot of times at the end of the month I was like, what the fuck did I do this month? Right? And I was going through emails and reconstructing things in a way that, is not best practice. And as a result, typically what I did was I undersold the amount of work that I did because I wasn't going to rip off a client, right? That's just straight unethical. So I was doing myself no no favors in that too. When I opened my firm, that was what I knew, right? And so I just started doing it that way. And up until the end of June, my dad worked with me at my firm. He was retired from Big Law and needed something to do so that my mom didn't kill him for being around and saying, well, why don't we paint the walls this color? And so he came on and he's old school, right? Well, we're going to bill by the hour. And when I started sort of questioning not just the efficacy, but the moral roots of hourly billing, the ethical roots of it, he got uncertain. And what I started realizing was, you know, defenders of the billable hour will say, well, it's transparent. It's like, why is it transparent that your hourly rate is $850? That seems like an arbitrary, like you think you can get away with it. That's why the number is what it is. Sure, you've been around for a while, right? But, it's just a number that you slapped on your time. But my time is not a unit of value for my clients. Frankly, my clients would love it if I could get it done in a half hour rather than 3 days, right? And so there was a real disconnect because I felt like it put a conflict between my incentives and what my clients wanted me to do, right? I Under the hourly model, I wanted to be really thorough, right? I wanted to make sure I turned over every stone and made sure that, and they wanted me to be really efficient. But really, the end goal that both of us wanted was good work. And I started thinking about, you know, there aren't a whole lot of industries that bill by the hour. It's us, accountants, sometimes architects, but I mean, it's a fairly limited and generally service based industry. And, you know, I had seen some firms, especially in estate planning, do flat fee. I was like, well, I mean, that makes sense. You're providing a known quantity at the end of this, right? So if the goal is an estate plan that suits what it is that you want for your family, I'm going to know fairly well what the value of that is for you and what the value of that is for me. So why don't we price it to match values, right? And when I started doing it, what I found was, clients were shocked that they weren't going to get that bill at the end of the month and sort of have an aneurysm when they open it, right? And the certainty of price gave them a lot of confidence in terms of, okay, well, you're not going to bleed me dry here, right? You're going to get me in saying, I think it'll probably take about 3 hours, and then 15 hours later, pull the rug out from you. And so, I moved exclusively over into flat fees and value-based pricing, right? For estate planning, I could put together the same plan, word for word, almost, for a family with 500,000 in assets, somebody with 25 million in assets. I'm not going to charge the same price because the tax benefits for the person with the 25 million in assets is going to be significantly different from the value provided to somebody with, a lower asset class. And all of that sort of intuitively made sense to me. And I tried to figure out how I could move some of that over into the business side of things.
It's interesting just to touch on the hourly a little bit. And I do a little bit of all the above still. And so I've tried to move away from it as much as I can. But I just, I think it takes a lot more work. Litigation there's a lot of factors that go in that. So I can see why people say, yeah, I can't do it. I don't think the answer is you can't do it. It's just more difficult.
You have to think
You
about
got
it a
to,
lot
yeah,
more.
it's easier just to say, go hourly and just go.
It's caveman economics,
instead
right?
of sitting down and really scoping out the project as much as
Right.
best you can and doing change orders along the way, whatever. But the other interesting thing is to your point there, for example, I've got 15 years in this practice area. There are things that I have seen, I've done that no one else has done. And there's no way that I could jack my hourly rate up enough
Right. To cover.
to
Right.
capture that value.
Yeah.
Now, frankly,
Right.
on some of the flat fee work, I have some agreements that literally could save a firm, millions of dollars over the span of their, and I'm not going to charge them, 250 grand
Right.
for it, but it
Right.
would be worth it for it.
Right.
It'd be worth it. But
Right. I mean, you can make an argument
yeah,
for it, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
They're going to say, well, how do I know it's going to save me that? Well, I can give you all these examples of where someone didn't have this and it cost them a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the balance. How do you capture? So if you're doing value-based billing, how do you, number one, capture the value and convey it to the client where they understand it? I mean, I do think, before you
Yeah.
start, clients love just have, I know this is the price and that's all I have to pay, but how do you
Mm-hmm.
convey the value to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are two components that you need to think about with value-based pricing, right? It's the value conveyed to them, but also, to yourself, right? And I think it's easy to focus on how do we make sure that a client understands how we're doing the pricing. But it's really important for the attorney or for the firm to really understand, you know, am I pricing this at a point that gets me out of bed, that wants me that I get excited to do the work, that I feel as though I am, it's really easy to not take that into account and then feel resentful in the process of doing the work because you realize, I'm giving a lot more here than I'm getting, right? And what it comes down to, when you're talking about value-based pricing, or at least the way that I talk about it with my clients is I want at the end of this for both of us to walk away saying, man, we got a deal. Right. And that's the premise of it is we both win, and there are all kinds of sales ways that people are encouraged to do this. Like, well, what would happen if You didn't have this. And it's like, I find that to be a little manipulative, right? It can be effective, right? Well, if you didn't have the special needs trust for your kid with, some disability, what would his life look like? If it's like, yeah, I mean, they already know that, right? You're playing into something and trying to get them to do something that you want without giving them the dignity of saying, no, we both understand this, and here's why we both know it's important. But I mean, for certain kinds of things, like what you were talking about, right? In the kinds of work that we do, we have a database of work that we've done before. We've seen how it plays out with different clients under different circumstances. And you can have an honest conversation with them and say, hey, look, I hope that you never need to use this estate plan this way, right? Because that's a really bad outcome and it's going to be painful for the people in your family. But if that situation does come up, here's how much it's going to help and why it's going to be the thing that you want. And having those conversations in a way that are just open as opposed to trying to push a price or something like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm naive in this, but I generally think that if you're just upfront and honest with people, they get it.
Let's talk about logistics. So you started out, you were doing hourly, then you moved to value
Mhm.
billing. Did you burn the boats, or was there an overlap period?
Um, Interesting question. I burned the boats. My dad continued billing by the hour because he just couldn't get his head around um, anything else. So my firm would issue bills that were hourly bills, but I didn't. And I think my dad got frustrated and ended up partially deciding to just fully retire and put his license in retirement because the way that the work that we were getting into the firm was moving just didn't fit the kind of things that he was comfortable doing. So, we basically, back in 2022, I just stopped billing by the hour. You know, which is interesting sometimes. If you're at an event and you get to know somebody a little bit, and they're like, "Cool, what's your hourly rate?" And it's like, "I don't have one," and just the blank look on their like, "Well, how'd you buy those clothes?"
Yeah.
Right? It's like there are other ways to do this. Let's talk about the ways that I can benefit you and you can benefit me. And when you go into Best Buy, right, and you want to buy a TV, they don't say, "I don't know how much you're going to watch it."
Mhm.
Right? The price is the price. They know their costs that went into it. They know what kind of profit they want to make, and there you go.
I was talking to an attorney last week, and he made a business model change, and he said for years he tried to do both, and it was
Mhm.
driving everybody crazy. And
Yeah,
finally, he just said, "All
yeah,
right, we're not doing it the old way anymore." And he said after that, it was like a
yeah,
just exponential
yeah.
curve up.
Having both of those types of thinking open is just confusing, right? Both to you and your staff, to clients, right? I can tell you that I when I moved from hourly to flat fees, I didn't have a single client who said, "Can we go back to hourly?" Right? In my business firm, when we went from hourly/flat fee to subscriptions, I had one client who said, "I don't know." Right? But everybody else was like, "This is great. We can budget for a subscription." Right? We know for a full year what our legal spend is going to be, at least at a fundamental baseline. And there's an aspect of business certainty that you can provide that is really beneficial.
All right, I'm glad you brought up the subscriptions because that's where I wanted to go next. So you also
Yeah.
do subscriptions. So I've played with this. I've talked to other lawyers that do it. I think it's great if you can figure out the scope,
Hmm.
and you got to worry
Yeah.
about what the scope is, no scope creep, the pricing. And then also, I have found for me, one of the more difficult parts, I mean, lawyers are my clients. They're used to
Hmm.
flat fees or hours. And I
Right.
tell them, hey, what about a subscription? And they're like, I'll just pay
They
you
don't get
when
it.
I need you. And I have not figured out a way yet. I'm going to, I just hadn't done it yet to
Mhm.
explain the value proposition where they get it. So, how did you venture into the
Yeah.
membership world and all of the above?
Yeah, it's an interesting change in the way that you think about what it is that you do, right? And so I have two different types of subscriptions, right? I have a sort of high level or higher price point subscription that is tailored to specific clients. Those generally start at about 1,500 a month and go up 10 times that, right? The way that I had that conversation is, all right, let's talk about what an average month looks like over the past year, right? Let's go through what kind of things have come up, and let's get a sense of, a scope with a standard deviation. And I propose a price, right? And I say, the way that this works is at the end of any month, either you or I can come to each other and say, I think the price is off, right? Either I think that it's too low or too high, and you think that it's too low or too high. And we'll have a negotiation about where we think that we are. The first 3 months, we don't do that because we're still just, if they're a new client, we set a price and we just sort of get a sense of how we work together, what kind of thing that looks like. And then at the end of that 90 days, we have a discussion and recalibrate. But the idea again goes back to, you know, every human being has a very, very carefully calculated sense of fairness, whether we're being ripped off or whether we're getting more than we think that we should, right? We often try to ignore it, right? Especially when it's to our advantage. But we know, right? If we set a price and it ended up being super easy, like like when you put that money in the bank, you're like, wow, okay. And we definitely know when we feel like we get ripped off, right? Like that's an instantaneous, like every blood vessel in your body like expands and it's like, what the hell is that? And so the bet is, if I get the right kinds of clients, we're just going to have an ongoing discussion and make sure that we both feel like we're being treated fairly. Now, part of the issue with that model is you have to be careful about who you choose to work with, right? Because you can get taken advantage of, at least for a little while. But the other thing is, if you do choose the right people, that relationship gets very close, right? You are trusted in a way that I was never trusted on an hourly basis, no matter how well I liked or was liked by a client. You get ingrained into the company itself, right? One of the benefits of those high level subscriptions is a lot of the time I'll be generally a fractional general counsel. I'll sit in on executive meetings or board meetings. I get to know the personalities of the C suite, right? Going in, if we're going to present something, I can have the insight to say, John and Susie are going to love this, right? Ron's going to be a real fucking problem here. So how are we going to position this so that we can get this through and everybody excited about it in a way that, for the most part, you're not going to have an hourly attorney spend the time making those connections, getting to know the personalities and things like that.
So I do like you went all in. I've heard some folks give a subscription where they say you get up to 5 hours per month. In my view, that's
Yeah.
not really a subscription. It's
No, that's hourly billing and drag.
yeah. And the other thing I liked, I mean, you just gotta start somewhere. You just gotta throw a price out there and see if it works. I do
Yeah.
like that 90
Yeah.
day sort of window where you guys sort of test it out.
Mhm.
I think that's smart. 1 month is too soon.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, 1 month can be an aberration,
yeah.
right? If you get a full quarter, you have a much better data set to determine whether or not you're wildly off or um, something like that.
Okay, so let me dive a little bit more on some of the technical software pieces of that.
Mhm.
Maybe I don't know if this comes into play or not. I know some people who
Yeah.
do these membership programs. They it's a well defined scope, and they have to feed them into the law firm machine a certain way, so
Mhm.
because they still do other kind of work, so they're coming in through the membership program and not through some other door, so to speak. So do
Mhm.
you have any certain software technology that you use, or do you scope out your membership in such a way that it doesn't matter?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because I think I mentioned I have two different levels of membership, right? So I've got the sort of higher price point, which is, sort of bespoke. You get me, and I port into your company, and we go from there. I also have a very low end, low cost entry point membership. Right? It's 150 or 295 a month. Right. It- The goal there, the goal there is to provide just the minimum level of comfort for true startups, right? Not, like pre-revenue or like very close to, beginning of a firm. And that is very carefully sculpted. It's I run it through Mighty Networks. So there's a community aspect. There are courses on there. There's a knowledge base. The idea is to provide an ability to go and self-help, but then also they can schedule calls with me, right? I found that most true startups, basically what they need from an attorney is to say, don't do that. That's you're going to bankrupt yourself, or you're, going to get yourself into trouble for an unsanctioned priced round, and all that kind of stuff. Or somebody just say, hey, I've got this idea. Can we talk for 15 minutes about it? Right. That covers it for most startups. But there aren't firms that meet that need, because the O'Melveny's and the big startup firms, they're not interested in unless they can get 15,000 at a minimum out of you, right? And so the idea with Seed Council, which is the low price point, is to get a minimum amount of help, teach businesses to do business the way that I think it ought to be done, and to grow businesses into the higher price point where I grow with them.
Welcome to the Founding Partner Podcast. Join your host, Jonathan Hawkins, as we explore the fascinating stories of successful law firm founders. We'll uncover their beginnings, triumph over challenges, and practice growth. Whether you aspire to launch your own firm, have an entrepreneurial spirit, or are just curious about the legal business, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
All right. So for the subscription stuff, some of the logistics I've heard. So for example, they have a scope and they say you can have unlimited access to me, but you have to contact me through this technology. And if you contact me
Yeah.
a different way, then you're going to get charged hourly rate or some sort of penalty. And you got to sort of train the clients to use the software. Did you have to go through that?
So I have not done it quite like that. I do require, I don't take unscheduled calls from anybody in any of my firms, but for Seed Council especially, there is a single link that gets to a calendar where they can schedule specifically for this. If they try any other way, I tell them straight out, I'm going to ignore the shit out of you. You're not going to get help. The only way to get me is clicking this link. I put that in the engagement agreement, right? We have a communications policy that they have to sign as well. And that's the exclusive way to get me. They can go into the Mighty Networks, leave a message, in a group board or something like that. Other people can respond to them. My staff can respond to them. But if they want me, there's one link and you press it.
That's key. You got to train them. So as this too, I know a lot of attorneys in the startup world will take equity as partial payment or in full payment of their services. Do you do that?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, in some ways, startup firms that do that, we're basically a very specialized kind of VC, right? Where we have to do some diligence on a company before we make that bet. But yeah, I have equity, I think now in 19. And the idea is that's payment up until you get revenue positive. At that point, we go on to a subscription and we go from there.
I like that. And look, it's like a VC fund, 1 in 10, 1 in 20 is going to pay off. The rest
Right.
are going to be losers. So
That's right.
you're almost
That's
there.
right.
You got one more and one of them's going to
I
work.
know. That's right. I get my lake house.
Cool. So we've talked a lot about law firm and all that kind of stuff. So let's shift some of your personal stuff. I know you got, like I said earlier, you got a lot of stuff you're doing, which is cool. So you've got a podcast called Sonder Union. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So Sonder Union came about, as do most of my projects, on a whim. And you mentioned DISC earlier. I'm a quick start of 10. And so I came up with the idea. I messaged 3 people to be guests before I had a chance to say, maybe this isn't the best idea. I got accomplices. And once I got accomplices, I had to do it. But the premise of the podcast is to explicitly have no business purpose at all, right? It's designed to bring on people that I know maybe a little bit, maybe have traded messages with, but have not spent any actual significant time with. And the design is to just have a conversation and learn a little bit about each other in a way that I hope does something a little bit different from most podcasts, which for good reason, have a business purpose. They're to invite people on to sell something or to push a project of theirs or something like that. And Sonder Union is kind of the anti-podcast in that sense, where you just get on and every episode is very different, right? Because it turns out to just be, we chase rabbits and we go from there.
Everybody needs some of that. I'm addicted to podcasts. I love business podcasts. I mean, hell, we're on one now.
Me too.
We're on one now.
Me too.
But I get business podcast fatigue, and sometimes I got to just do something. It's like I don't read beach books, but it's a similar thing. You need the candy. You don't have to think as much. Just have fun with. That's cool. So is it a fairly regular thing, or is it just sort of as you find somebody?
It's usually about once every 2 weeks. When my wife had our baby, I didn't have the baby. That would be a different story. When my wife had our baby in July, things tailed off a little bit. And so there was a bit of a break, but getting back on that horse and getting some stuff out now too. So yeah, I mean, it's fun to do, but it's also kind of a slog to get everything set up and to make sure that you've got somebody ready to go for the next one and getting the editing done and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah. So if running 2 law firms, doing a podcast weren't enough, you're also writing a book, right?
Yeah, I am 60,000 words into a novel. And the thing, if you're out and people say, so what do you do? Right? So many of us default to our day jobs, right? And when I'm asked that question, lawyer appears like 7th or 8th on the list of the way that I think of myself. I like being a lawyer now. I didn't when I was in big law, but I like the work that I do now. And I like the challenge of it and all that kind of stuff. But if I didn't make money doing it, I would stop now. Wouldn't do it. I don't find that the law itself is intrinsically interesting at all. It's in that middle part of the Venn diagram where things that I'm good at and things that people will pay me to do, right? There's a tiny sliver in the middle there, and law fits into that sliver. So, I found a way to make it work for me. But I think of myself more as a writer, as a musician, as somebody who is generally a creative. And some of that, so it's interesting because the sort of unlock for me with business was realizing that building a business was a creative endeavor. When I was a kid, I didn't realize that, right? That you are breathing life into something and giving it character, and you are creating something that wasn't there. And that itself is fun. And so there's an aspect of that fits into the creative aspect of the way that I generally think of myself.
Completely agree with you. It's funny about building a business, whether it's a law firm or anything else. It wasn't there before. You had a blank canvas.
Right.
It was in your head maybe, and you had a seed, and then it's grown. A lot of times it grows in ways you never even imagined when you started it. And it's fun. It's hard, but it's fun. It's funny. The other thing you said is how you self-identify. I grew up playing the drums. I haven't really played hardly in years, but I still view myself as a drummer.
Of course. Right. Because there was a point in your life where that was incredibly important to you, I'm sure. Right.
I wanted to be a rock star at one point. Yeah.
Yeah, I tried. It obviously didn't work. But there's something that you learn from about yourself from doing those kind of things, right? I am very much an introvert, right? I didn't realize this until later in life, but most performers are. We think of performers as these larger than life, and we think, oh, they're just extroverts. I mean, sure, there are some, but for the most part, introverts are the ones who get up on stage and inhabit something, right? If you put me in a room unstructured with a bunch of people, I'm a wallflower. If you put me on stage with everybody looking at me, I turn on, right? And there's a weird dichotomy in that kind of dynamic.
Yeah, I can see that. It's a way to express yourself when maybe in a normal circumstance it's harder. I'm the same boat. I'm more of an introvert. And it's like getting on stage, you're nervous as hell, but it's just feels good.
It does. Good. Yeah.
Real quick, thanks for listening. If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. It would really mean a lot to me. Now back to the show. So you're a musician. So tell me about that. What do you play? What kind of stuff do you do?
Yeah, so I mean, my main instrument is guitar, but I can fake it well enough on drums, bass, banjo. I can play mandolin, but I'm 6'6", and the necks are tiny. Like fingering the frets with meatball hands is a little bit difficult. I can play keys enough that you probably wouldn't know that I have no idea what I'm doing, but entirely self-taught. My mom got me guitar lessons when I first got the guitar, and I walked in and the guy was like, okay, we're going to learn to read music, and the first song you're going to learn is the Ode to Joy. I was like, want to play Hendrix. What the hell is this? Like, no, I'm out.
So do you compose? Do you compose stuff, record stuff?
Yeah.
That's cool. You can do it all. I like those kind of musicians that do all the tracks. Do that?
I do. Yeah.
That's sweet. That's awesome.
It's a way to decompress now, right? I used to do it. It's amazing how you go through stages with things, right? And using music as an analogy to any number of the things that we've talked about here, right? I started doing it because I was curious and it sounded like it would be fun, right? And then I got just good enough at it to realize that, hey, I could be pretty good at this, and you get serious, right? And then you get far enough along that you're playing with other people and you get really good and you get on stage and you start playing shows and you start touring a little bit. And then it becomes work, right? It's not fun anymore because you're doing the same tracks over and over again. You're playing the same songs the same way, and somebody starts getting bored in the middle of a show and does something that's unexpected, and it keeps morphing that way. But at some point, you stop doing it because it's work and you let it lay fallow for a little bit. And then you come back to it and it's fun again. I think a lot of us approach our businesses kind of in the same way sometimes, right? At first, it's like, okay, this is going to be great. And then you go through that same sort of progression where you get bigger and bigger and you get better. And then at some point, you're like, fuck this.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about drumming is that you can see incremental gains. Like you suck. Yeah. When you first learn a new polyrhythm or whatever, you're like, you can't even do it. Your brain doesn't work. And then you slow it down, you get a little bit better. And then you get a little bit better, a little bit faster, and a little bit smoother. And then 2 months later, it's super easy. And you're like, you don't even remember how hard it was. And it's like, I see that in all aspects of my life. If you just keep trying, you're going to get better.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the, if not the most impactful skill that somebody can develop is some comfort in sucking at something long enough to get good at it, right? Knowing that it's not going to be immediately where you want it to be. That when you're practicing, your parents are going to say, could you be a little bit quieter for a while, right? You're killing my ears. Whether that's learning an instrument or building out a new practice area or whatever it is, if you're comfortable at not being good at it for long enough that you get slowly better at it and competent and then good, that's what it's all about.
It's funny. I just remembered I have these dreams from time to time, getting deep here, where I haven't played drums very much in a long time, but it's like I'm going on stage for a show and I just completely screw it up. It's like, what did I do that for? That was my shot and I screwed it up. Well, this has been fun, man. We've been going at it for a while, so I appreciate you coming on. But for anybody out there that wants to find you, number one, I'll say I recommend people follow you on LinkedIn. That's where I came across you, and you have some really insightful and deep posts on there that make you think. So keep doing that. But other than LinkedIn, if somebody wants to find you, what's the best place?
Yeah. I mean, if you would like to email me, it's Owen@McGrann, McGrann law.com. You can also go to the website or seedcouncil.io. I stay off social media except for LinkedIn, but I do respond. I'm not scary. So.
Well, cool. Well, thanks again.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Founding Partner Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on the latest episodes. You can also connect with Jonathan on LinkedIn and check out the show notes with links to resources mentioned throughout our discussion by visiting www.lawfirmgc.com. We'll see you next time for more origin stories and insights from successful law firm founders.